Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So today I'll be talking about this sense in which the awakening, or if you like, ascent of the psyche for Plato must happen in this series of steps, and what that means for us as we try to live out and make sense of our desire. When I say the series of steps, I'm talking, of course, about the ladder of eros, which really means both, eros really means both love and desire. This image the prophetess Diotima has presented us with in the symposium. It's an image basically of an ideal living out of our desire, a series of stages by which we would rise from our everyday desire for, you could say, physical satisfaction in enjoyment of the beautiful things we encounter, to an ecstatic vision of the absolute beauty, which is the absolute good, a vision which transforms us for the better. But as I mentioned last time, Plato, through Diotima, gives us no explanation of why it's necessary to go through this real-life process. And this question might naturally arise for us because, based on what we read elsewhere in the Platonic and Neoplatonic writings, thought alone could take us to the same conclusion, that our desire is satisfiable only through some sort of communion with the absolute good. Moreover, as we saw last time, it seems from what Diotima has told us about the latter, that this experiential, or if you like, phenomenological approach on its own isn't guaranteed to take the psyche upward. It isn't necessarily, in other words, going to make plain the ultimate identity of the subjective and objective good. Philosophy is needed to help remove the veil that prevents us from seeing only the good. So then, why do we need the latter at all? Well, I think there are two reasons why Plato introduces this image. The first is really what we've already touched on. He wants to convey this sense of what you could perhaps call the tragic in natural human life. There's something on the one hand about eros, much like Geist in the Hegelian phenomenology, that wants to manifest its truth and ascend the ladder. To some extent, in other words, eros is naturally self-realizing. But the sort of tragic flaw is the absence of that principle in everyday life, that is, that would fully enable the self-realization of eros. It needs philosophy to really fully actualize itself. Now, of course, for Plato, the impulse to philosophize is also a manifestation of eros. But it's plain to him also that for most people, it's not likely to really manifest itself in this way without outside guidance or stimulation, without some kind of Socrates figure. The second reason why we need this step-by-step process is, I think, more complex, but probably even more significant, and it has to do with this really quite fundamental fact of the Platonic philosophy, that it encompasses not just philosophy as we would normally understand it today, but also psychology. The Platonic tradition really kind of defies this neat separation we have today between the spheres of philosophy and psychology, or, if you like, psychotherapy. Plato says in the Republic that philosophy gets us to a better life by a conversion of the whole self, not just the mind, to the good. And generally he's fond of speaking of philosophy as care of the psyche or soul. This, as we know, is a hallmark of Socrates, and he even uses language that sometimes really anticipates modern terminology. In the Charmides, for example, Socrates quotes with approval a Thracian physician saying, quote, "The treatment of the soul, therapoiesthai, detain psychein, the therapy of the psyche, so he said, my wonderful friend, is by means of certain charms. And these charms are words of the right sort. By the use of such words is temperance," and the Greek word here is sophrosune, which temperance never really seems to quite convey. It's really more about inner harmony, really. By the use of such words is sophrosune engendered in our souls, in tes psyches. You can really see this sort of therapeutic understanding of philosophy in a Platonist like Marsilio Ficino, for whom philosophy seems above all to be a cure for melancholy. Anyway, Freud himself was aware of his indebtedness to Plato. I've mentioned earlier in this series of how he wrote about how much of his thinking came from, as he put it once, the divine Plato. And of course, the role of the psychoanalyst, as set out by Freud and continued by therapists today, is really as a kind of facilitator. The therapist plays, like Socrates, this maieutic, and the word comes from the Greek word maiotikos, having to do with midwifery role. So both the therapist and Socrates play this role in facilitating the birth of something new. In the case of Platonic philosophy, the birth of, I guess you could say, of a new psyche, of a renewed psyche. Now, of course, there's a difference also between the Platonic and the modern psychologies. And I think this lies in the fact that the good as such must be beyond the scope of objective science, since the good as such, as opposed to, the good qua the health of the psyche, for example, the good as such, as we saw, is not an object, but rather transcends the distinction of subject and object. And this is why I think that, like science in general, even the Enlightenment in general, for all the good they bring, they're not, and therapy by itself is not sufficient for human happiness. Anyway, my point is that for Plato, philosophy has to be therapeutic. And indeed, we saw that the ascent of the psyche that Platonism has in mind isn't just a rational process. It doesn't work on a purely conscious level. We've spoken before about how it is really a process of remembering a kind of buried knowledge of the absolute good, the absolute oneness of being. But for us to reach this absolute good, our cognition of the good must transcend the distinction of subjective and objective. It must embrace both of these, if you like, parts or aspect of the self. It must satisfy both subjective and objective desire. It must satisfy our desire to be happy in the sense of feeling pleasure and to be good, objectively good, so subjectively and objectively good. It must take both into itself, and it must fulfill both. And so it's not enough for the good to be simply known to be good. It must also be felt as good. It must also be experienced as pleasure. In other words, it must be perceived as good both mediately through the medium of abstract thought and immediately. But in the philosophical argument we've traced out, of course, we experience it only as an object of thought. We don't perceive it as good in an immediate way. And this is the problem that our normal consciousness, our fallen state, if you will, presents us with. Somehow not just our conception of what is true, but also our experience of what is pleasant. Both have to change. Our remembering of the primal unity that is also primal goodness will have to involve both. And what Platonic philosophy actually has in common with modern psychotherapy, in my opinion, is the idea of resistance. Resistance was actually central to psychoanalysis as developed by Freud. For Freud, it was really the manifestation of disunity in the soul, or if you like, psyche. In his 1932 lecture, Revision of the Theory of Dreams, he writes, "Resistance is the surest sign to us of a conflict. There must be a force here which is seeking to express something, and another which is striving to prevent its expression." And in another lecture published the same year, the dissection of the psychical personality, he ties resistance in with the unconscious repression that his therapy aims to bring to light. The idea is that the patient is cured because bringing to light the largely unconscious convictions behind his or her resistance to change also leads to the loosening of the hold of these convictions and the curing of the patient. He writes, "The whole theory of psychoanalysis is, as you know, in fact built up on the perception of the resistance offered to us by the patient when we attempt to make his unconscious conscious to him. The objective sign of this resistance is that his associations fail or depart widely from the topic that is being dealt with. He may also recognize the resistance subjectively by the fact that he has distressing feelings when he approaches the topic. But this last sign may also be absent. We then say to the patient that we infer from his behavior that he is now in a state of resistance, and he replies that he knows nothing of that and is only aware that his associations have become more difficult. It turns out that we were right, but in that case, his resistance was unconscious too, just as unconscious as the repressed, at the lifting of which we were working. We should long ago have asked the question, from what part of his mind does an unconscious resistance like this arise? The beginner in psychoanalysis will be ready at once with the answer. It is, of course, the resistance of the unconscious. An ambiguous and unserviceable answer. If it means that the resistance arises from the repressed, we must rejoin, certainly not. We must rather attribute to the repressed a strong upward drive, an impulsion to break through into consciousness. And we're reminded here, of course, of the strong upward drive of Platonic eros. It's sort of natural desire, the sort of unconscious desire of each of us to regain our wings. Freud, by the way, goes on to attribute the power of resistance to the superego or the ego and basically admit that this puts him in the awkward position of saying that the ego and or superego aren't always conscious. Anyway, contemporary psychology, of course, doesn't necessarily embrace this Freudian schema and vocabulary, but generally it accepts the basic idea of resistance, which it attributes to a great extent to the power of shame. Now, there's kind of an important distinction that needs to be made at this point. Throughout this whole series, I've been using these terms mediate and immediate cognition, as though all our mental activity neatly divided in that way. And yet, this isn't really how the psyche works. What goes on inside us, what's going on inside me and you right now, isn't simply either of these, but both living in a way as though married with one another. Although the mediated and immediate cognition can certainly be separated out in thought, we're basically talking, after all, about just reason and feeling, which at least seem to be easy to distinguish. Actual consciousness consists in their mutual interpenetration. On the one hand, feeling is always going to accompany thinking, even the feeling perhaps not noticed by us that it's pleasant to be thinking. On the other hand, these feelings that may seem immediate to us tend to have reasons, assumptions, as it were, built into them. And this is the case for pleasure also. It may seem at first, perhaps especially if we look at pleasure in the way that sort of mechanistic philosophers have looked at it, that pleasure is in a way something fixed. There are some experiences that are pleasant and some that are unpleasant, and basically that is that. I think the assumption behind this is that pleasure and pain are entirely immediate, and to some extent this is true, of course. It's hard to imagine a blow to the head being anything other than unpleasant. And yet, I think it's actually undeniable that these things are really more semi-immediate. For something to be perceived as pleasant by a human being, it must really also be judged to be so. There's always some element of conscious of judgment for this psychic moment or movement to fully realize itself to human consciousness. And the same, I think, is true of all our emotions. For example, until one has the thought, I am sad or I am happy, these emotions always had a kind of latent or a sort of only semi-actualized quality. And so when it comes to the pleasure of the sense that our desire is being satisfied, much of that too is going to depend on our thoughts. And so if we've had the thought occur to us that bodily beauty, for example, is not really the fullness of beauty, the pleasure we would take in the perception of bodily beauty is going to be undermined. There's an anxiety in the sense that we might be wrong about it that is going to work against our pleasure response. So what does all this have to do with this question of why we need Diotima's ladder? Well, what it means is if we have this thought of the absolute good only as something we encounter in reasoning, it's not going to work because we're going to resist it. And this is, I think, because of the nature of the all-embracing power of pleasure, the good, that's to say, the good as we experience it subjectively. You may be familiar with this Emily Dickinson poem, The Heart Asks Pleasure First, which kind of lays down pleasure as the principle of psychic life. Our sense of what's pleasant, after all, guides us every moment of our lives, even in our discernment of the truth. For example, when we're persuaded of something, we are persuaded in some sense, admittedly, out of rational necessity, yet at the same time, the being persuaded happens when we realize it's no longer pleasant to come up with objections. It's not fun anymore, and we concede. We stop experiencing pleasure in coming up with objections, then go back to the point that was being argued and weigh it, and realize the weighing, or if you like, contemplation of this point now gives us more pleasure than the search for objections. What this kind of absolute power of pleasure in our lives means is that a significant shift in our conception of what is the principle of pleasure, the principle of the subjective good, is going to be massively disorienting to us. That's what this absolute power of pleasure means. Utterly disorienting to the point of causing us to lose our moorings, our ability to discern how to live and move and have our being. And this, of course, is Zeus for the Greek poet quoted by St. Paul in his letter to the Corinthians. But it's also in pleasure that we do all these things, which is why depression, the loss of an ability to experience pleasure, can be so debilitating. So we're naturally going to resist a deep challenge to our conception of the pleasurable, the subjective good. It's not something the ramifications of which we're going to be able to cope with easily. And so we're all going to unconsciously resist it, which is something we'll probably find ourselves doing every step of the way. And the only way to overcome that resistance is, in fact, to bring it to light at each step of the way, to bring to light the unconscious reasons for our resistance, the unconscious assumptions we bring to what is and isn't pleasurable. And this is precisely how Diotima's ladder of Eros works. The ascent or unification of the soul or psyche must be progressive. It must happen in a series of steps because of the opposition to it in the form of a vast network of assumptions which can only be tackled one by one. And so how does one go about this? How exactly do we make our way up the ladder? Well, that's what I'll be starting to look at next time. Until then, be well, and thanks for watching.